Hello, if you're wondering what this is that's randomly popped up, you've got a bonus bit of teaching this week. This is because on Saturday I did a talk for the men's breakfast in Stretton, and I thought I would put it out online for those who are unable to join us. It's a talk about Celtic spirituality. It's called Thin Places, Full Hearts, Rediscovering Celtic Spirituality in a Rural World. I hope you enjoy. There's a beach just outside Columba in East Runton. It's got a tiny little car park on one of the cliffs overlooking it, and there's a bench just outside the car park, a plain old bench that if you sit at just the right angle on it, it gives you incredible views across the rocks and out to sea. And at the right angle you can't see any buildings, any signs of human life, just sky, sea and stone. Of course, if you look the other way, you spot Columba Pier, slightly less holy, or at least not that kind of holy. I used to find myself at East Runton quite a lot in my early 20s. It's just up the road from where my in-laws live, and when life got overwhelming or difficult for reasons, that place, that quiet, windswept, mostly empty, except for the odd dog walker place, became a kind of sanctuary for me. I felt closer to God there, like it was just him and me and no distractions. I wonder if you can relate to that. Maybe there's a place you feel more spiritual, closer to something bigger than yourself. For some people it's standing on a cliff top or walking through a forest. For others it might be sitting in a centuries-old church where the walls seem to hold the prayers of generations gone by. Or maybe it's not a place at all. Maybe it's being with a certain group of people who make you feel connected, known, grounded. The earliest Christians in these isles had a phrase for places like this. They called them thin places. Imagine a kind of veil or screen between heaven and earth. In most places it's thick, it's solid, we feel the divide. But every now and then there are places where the screen is worn thin, threadbare, cracked, and heaven peeks through. Now you might be thinking, that's lovely, Phil, great image, so what? Fair enough, but here's the thing. If the early Christians knew something about spiritual closeness that I've come to see as true off my own back, what else did they know that I haven't discovered yet and I could learn from them? What if their way of thinking about God, the world and our place in it could help us, not in some abstract historical way, but in a real practical way of living our lives in messy modern times? Because how we experience God, if we do, is shaped by loads of things. Our personal history, our family background, the society we live in, even the landscape around us, culture, place, rhythm, it all plays a part. The earliest Christians in Britain lived in a way that they lived in a very different society to ours. They didn't have the internet, TV, they didn't even have a concept of the United Kingdom as we have now. But they lived in the same land that we do now. And particularly in rural areas like the one where I minister, it's clearly the same land, it's the same mountains. Well, maybe not mountains in Warwickshire, but it's the same rivers, the same fields. So a huge part of what shapes the way that we are wired spiritually will be the same as the things that were shaping the way our forebears were spiritually wired. And that's why of late there's been a bit of a movement, for want of a better word, to explore the spirituality of these early Christians in our country and to adapt it into something that works for us today. You may have heard of modern groups like the Iona community and the Northumbria communities. Well, those names may not mean anything to you, but there are groups of Christians looking at the lives and teachings of those early Christians and trying to work together to extrapolate out lessons that can take in and that we can take in and use in both our communal worship together, but also in our day-to-day lives as people living on the same land as these early Celtic Christians. But before we dig into the spirituality and what we're doing with it now, a bit of historical context for you. When Christianity first started to take root in these isles, it was through the work of missionary monks, many of them from Ireland, who didn't arrive with grand cathedrals or political clout, but with a deep sense of calling, a boat, and often no idea where they would end up. Some of these monks would literally set off into the sea in little coracles, trusting that the Spirit would take them wherever they were meant to go. One of the most famous of these was St. Columba, who left Ireland and founded the monastery on Iona, a tiny island off the west coast of Scotland in 563 AD. From there, he and his companions helped to re-evangelise large parts of Scotland and northern England. Another name you might have heard is Aidan of Lindisfarne. He was an Irish monk who brought the faith to Northumbria from Iona, founding the famous monastery at Lindisfarne in around 635. Now, the Christianity that developed in these early communities was a bit different to the Roman version that eventually came over with Augustine and his team. The Roman Church was hierarchical, structured, and very much tied to empire. The Celtic expression, by contrast, was more organic, less about buildings and more about communities, less about rules and more about rhythms. Their monasteries weren't tucked away behind cloistered walls. They were hubs of local life. People came for prayer, for education, for healing, for hospitality. These monks were farmers, craftspeople, scholars and scribes. They copied the scriptures by hand and illustrated them with incredible artwork, not to sell on Etsy, but because they believed beauty mattered to God. And this wasn't just an Irish thing. There were strongholds of the faith all over the place. Wales was a massive centre with saints like St David there. Even here in England, before the Roman influence became dominant, these Celtic expressions flourished in the north and west, where the hills were high and the Romans were scarce and the sheep outnumbered the bishops. Now, I'm not saying they got everything right. They were still people of their time. But their way of following Jesus feels surprisingly relevant for today. They prayed as they walked, worked, rested and ate. They lived close to nature, not above it, and they believed that the sacred wasn't just in the temples or the liturgies, but in the soil, the sea and the seasons. So before we go thinking of them as some kind of ancient novelty act, let's just pause and ask ourselves, what if they were onto something? And I've got two specific things I want to draw out. So firstly, for those early Celtic Christians, God was in the everyday. Faith was a rhythm, not a slot. One of the most remarkable things about Celtic Christianity is how deeply ingrained into everyday life it was. There wasn't a sacred secular split. You didn't go to church in the modern sense. You lived your faith. They had prayers for lighting the fire, for milking cows, for setting out on journeys and for returning home. And these weren't quaint rituals. They were ways of acknowledging that God was in the middle of everything. It's a deeply rural way of thinking, actually, isn't it? Life governed by seasons, rhythms, weather. Faith becomes less about set times and more about noticing. It's prayer that flows like a stream, not like a bucket you tip out on a Sunday. And in a world that feels so increasingly frantic and fragmented, maybe it's the kind of spirituality that we need to recover, one that slows us down, reroutes us in creation and reminds us God is already here. We just need to see. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think they teach us is the importance of community. Spirituality is not a solo sport. There's a danger, of course, in romanticising all of this. Imagine lone monks on misty cliffs finding God in solitude. And there was solitude, but never isolation. Celtic Christian communities were in fact incredibly communal. Monasteries weren't just places for the ultra-holy. They were centres of learning, healing, hospitality, even farming. Prayer happened together. Pilgrimage was done together. Wisdom was shared together. Even when someone went off to a remote island, they were sent out by a community, prayed for by a community, and they usually returned to one. And I think that's one of the tensions we feel in our rural parishes. We have the beauty, we have the stillness, we might even have our own thin places, but we don't always have that same sense of walking the faith journey side by side. Some of us live quite isolated lives, and even when we come to church, it can be hard to build deep relationships when we are scattered across multiple villages and only meet occasionally. The Celtic model reminds us faith is not just personal, it's communal as well. Even if you hear God clearly out on your morning walk, you still need someone to help you make sense of what he's saying. Now let me be clear, I'm no expert in Celtic spirituality. 15 years ago, sitting on that bench in East Runton, I'd never even heard the phrase thin place. But in recent months, I've been reading, reflecting, and dipping a bit of a toe into Celtic spirituality. And the more I do, the more I sense there's something in this with real potential to deepen our spiritual lives, not just as a church community, but as individuals living rural lives, often surrounded by beauty, but also by busyness and isolation. So here are two ways that Celtic spirituality is shaping what we're doing as a Benefice. Firstly, to draw your attention to our Celtic services. We've been weaving threads of Celtic spirituality into our regular Sunday worship. Some of you may already be familiar with our 9 o'clock Celtic breakfast services that happen in Granborough, Broughton and Flecknoe. These have been running for a while now. But more recently, in the last month or so, we've added an 11 o'clock Celtic All Sorts service at Stretton on the 4th Sunday of the month. What makes these services Celtic? It's not incense or ancient chants or anything like that. It's the atmosphere. They're quiet, they're contemplative, they draw on simple poetic prayers from the Celtic tradition. Prayers that aren't afraid to speak into the ordinary details of life. The lighting of fire, the beginning of the day, the tasks of the week. And there's space for silence, for reflection, for being, not just doing. And importantly, they're designed to build community. Those 9 a.m. breakfast services I mentioned, we pause halfway through to break bread together and share breakfast. At 11 a.m. there's always a warm welcome and time for fellowship, but that tends to be at the end of the service rather than in the middle. Because stillness doesn't mean solitude. We walk this journey together. So that's one thing that's shaping us as a Benefice because of Celtic spirituality. The second is actually kind of hot off the press, quite literally. Over the last few weeks and months, I've been doing a little bit of work trying to create some simple spiritual journals, not homework books or devotionals in the traditional sense. They're more like companions or little guides and spaces for our thoughts when we're in those thin places. Each one is kind of as much like a notebook as anything else, but it contains some gentle prompts, some guided reflections and space to write and doodle. It's just there to guide and help us take time out in these thin places to be still and to draw our attention towards God in them. They're all designed to be carried around with us to a bench, a field, a windowsill, wherever our thin place might be. As I said, that news is hot off the press. You may have seen a note on All Things Stretton recently about one of them. More details will follow soon. So, whether you're a walker, a gardener, a coffee drinker by the window, my hope is that through the things we can learn from our Celtic forebears, through the things that we're putting in place into the Benefice, we can all start to rediscover a way of being with God that's unhurried, that's rooted, that's real, a way of spirituality that fits with our landscape and fits with our lives.